Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on today's webinar. Before we begin, I just want to provide some brief housekeeping rules. All the lines will be muted except for the speakers. We're hoping this allows the best sound quality for all the participants. We've also turned all the screens dark except for the speakers to avoid distractions, so please don't think anything is wrong with your computer. There will be a Q&A section after the moderated discussion with all the speakers. If you have a question, we ask that you submit your question in the chat option. A number of you have submitted questions, and we're hoping to get to those questions too. This webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a copy of the recording along with a number of resources in a post follow-up email early next week. I will now introduce Dr. Allison Sokol, Assistant Director of P12 Policy at EdTrust, for a brief introduction to our webinar.
Thanks, Sergio. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about helping all students access learning opportunities during school closures. This webinar is co-hosted by us here at the Education Trust, Digital Promise, the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Across the country, schools are closed. And these school closures are a stark reminder of the important role that schools can play in the lives of children and young adults. For many students, schools are a place of stability where they can learn and grow and nurture relationships. And for many students, schools are also a source of daily meals. However, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups like homeless students and students in foster care were less likely to get a rigorous, engaging, and positive educational experience, and that was true before the pandemic. Now, these students are experiencing a whole host of additional challenges. In many communities, students don't have consistent access to their own devices or access to reliable high-speed internet to connect to distance learning opportunities, and as has been increasingly reported in the news, low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately experiencing the health and economic impacts of this pandemic. And there is a real risk that school closures are going to deepen existing inequities. So how do we, as education advocates, prevent that from happening? One of the most important places to focus our attention is at the district level, because many states are leaving decisions about how, or even whether, to continue instruction during school closures entirely or partially up to districts. According to a recent analysis that was in the 74 million, about a third of states, only a third of states, require districts to offer some kind of remote learning, leaving many districts to decide how to proceed. And even among the states that are requiring or encouraging districts to create distance learning plans, most aren't providing clear expectations about what districts have to offer. All of that is why the Education Trust and Digital Promise, with support from the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the Migration Policy Institute, created a guide that was released today to help equity advocates and district leaders as they engage in what are important but difficult conversations about how to ensure that kids, particularly our most vulnerable kids, have equitable access to distance learning now and for however long school buildings are closed. I think it's worth stating the obvious here that this isn't necessarily a short-term problem, not one like we might have thought, and that depending on public health guidance, districts may need to continue distance learning for the summer and even parts of next year. So this issue is going to be relevant for a while. In this guide, we touch on a range of issues: access to technology, additional services for vulnerable populations, communication with families and educators, assessing and communicating about students' academic progress, and supporting students, families, and educators' well-being. We share ideas that advocates and district leaders can consider when planning how to continue teaching and supporting students. And those ideas are based on what we see states and districts doing right now. But these are unprecedented times, a phrase I think we've all heard a lot. There isn't research or data on best practices for continuing education in a global pandemic. And so a key role for advocates and district leaders is to monitor how the challenges that this pandemic poses are being addressed and to urge transparency about the impact of district's efforts on all students. So in our webinar today, we're going to share more about the information that's in this guide, more about those promising examples of work going on around the country and ideas for you to consider. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Eric Duncan, who's the Senior Data and Policy Analyst at the Education Trust, who's going to be moderating a panel discussion for the bulk of the webinar. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. So we're really excited to have everyone here. And we have a really great set of panelists whose organizations and leadership on this has been just amazing in putting together this work. So quickly, our four panelists, you've already met Allison Sokol, who's our Assistant Director of P12 Policy at the Education Trust. We also have Lindsay Jones, who's President and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. We have Melissa Lazarin, who is the Senior Advisor for State Early Childhood and K-12 Policy at the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigration Integration Project. We have Barbara Pape, the Director of Communications from the Learner Variability Project at Digital Promise. So we have, as you see, a nice range of folks to weigh in on this really important issue. I'd like to ask each panelist just to briefly say hello and give a brief introduction about why this issue is important to you and your organization. Why don't we start with Lindsay?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us today. We're so excited to be part of this amazing resource that we feel is just so needed. The National Center for Learning Disabilities is an organization that represents parents and children, families of students with learning and attention issues. And they are deeply impacted by all that's happening in this current crisis, and already we're experiencing some large achievement gains. So we knew immediately that we had to sort of kick into gear to provide resources that could help. And we're so excited to be here with the great partners on this call today.
Thanks, Lindsay. Melissa?
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. I always forget that. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be a part of this as well. And always nice to work with that trust and all the groups represented here. So MPI, for those who aren't familiar, we are a think tank here in Washington, D.C., focused on migration, not just in North America or in the Americas, but also in Europe. I work on the integration side of things. So we work on everything from early childhood up into adult ed. And this is very important to us because we, of course, work with immigrant populations and English learners, but we're also working with state-based organizations in a handful of states that are really at the front lines of this response and working with the families and communities that are being touched by this the most.
Thank you, Melissa. And Barbara?
There we go. I am also honored to be working with EdTrust, who I've valued highly for so many years, and to be on this panel with Melissa and Lindsay. And when the name of your group is Digital Promise, it's sort of clearly understood why this issue is so important, particularly in closing the digital divide. And at Digital, just a little explanation, at Digital Promise, we work at the intersection of education leaders, researchers, and technology developers. And the overall goal of the organization is to improve learning opportunities for each student and to close the digital learning gap. So it puts us right there, and to do it taking care, obviously, of kids of color, kids living in poverty, and students also with disabilities.
Thanks, Barbara. And you did a really good job of framing the issue, I think, for us, which, you know, as we've transitioned to distance learning and you know, sort of the learning continuity that we'll sort of need to to see moving forward. We know, and you know as well as anyone, that these issues have been persistent in terms of the digital divide and communities not having access to internet or devices at home that are essential to maintaining this distance learning. And so wanted to sort of just go back to you, Barbara, and if you could maybe talk a little bit about how some of these issues, the digital divide, and how it sort of impacts children of color and students from low-income families, how they are related to home access during these times, and what can you share, if anything, that you've seen for advocates that are, you know, emerging good practices to help close that digital divide.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Eric. But before I begin even with these district examples, I wanted to explain something. I interviewed for this project and another one I'm doing with EdTrust, district superintendents from Digital Promises League of Innovative Schools. And all of them said that the way they handled this, and remember, they were given, many of them, 2 days. So were teachers, parents, kids, 2 days to turn this baby around. And when I interviewed them, they all said that their response to COVID-19 closures was done in phases. And the first phase was to guarantee food security. The second phase was the access to, boosting access to technology. Then it was SEL for both students and adults. Communicate and connect was sort of their motto. And finally, they started to talk about planning for distance learning. They needed to make sure all those other aspects were in place. Planning for distance learning and re-entry to schools and beyond. What does that mean? And remembering once again that they only got about 2 days of notice to pull this all off. So, but to talk about home access, we need to discuss what is the digital learning gap. And what it's caused by differences in how Americans in and out of school. It's not just a school issue, it's also an out of school issue. Access and use technology to improve learning opportunities and outcomes for all kids. Or when we talk with learner variability terms, we would say for each kid, because each kid comes to the table with with their variability. While many already know that a gap existed, right? We all pretty much knew there was a digital learning gap. COVID-19 revealed the extent of this gap and who it hurts most: students of color, low-income students, and students with disabilities. And the way we define it at Digital Promise, there are 3 aspects to the digital divide. There's access, and this is the one we're going to talk about today, which is hardware and broadband speed, participation, and then powerful use of. I also want to preface everything with that at Digital Promise. We do not believe that tech is where a kid sits in an isolation chamber staring at a screen, nor do we think that tech is there to replace a teacher. So just starting off with that helps. So computers, the first thing you think about when you think about access is, do you have access to computers? And what we found was that districts who already had a strong infrastructure in place, and there were some of them, whether it was access to computers or if they had a district-wide social and emotional learning plan in place, while they found this transition jolting, like we all did, it was easier to manage and move on to learning. And so Richland 2, a South Carolina school district in the suburb of Columbia, and other districts, they assessed their digital gaps years ago. And so it became a 1-to-1 district. So even if in those districts, even if it was like grades 3 through 12 had computers, it was much easier to figure out how to handle K through 2, right? As opposed to no one having anything. I also want to point out, and they aren't in this publication actually, but they're going to be in the other one. Brooklyn Lab charter schools in New York City, really hard hit by this virus. They immediately surveyed families and decided to loan Chromebooks to families who needed them to make sure that they were able to continue learning at home. However, it's one thing to actually have a computer. The big question is, do you have the broadband to connect? Lindsay School District, it's in the agricultural belt of California. They have a really cute story. So some years ago, they told me that students sitting on the front lawn of the district office building, and they didn't know what are they doing there. There's like 30, 40 kids sitting there. They realized they were accessing the school's Wi-Fi to download their assignments and their reading. So Lindsay got on board with the kids, and working with the city and utilities, they were able to put transmitters on their taller buildings to gain faster broadband. Every student has had a device for a while, and since 2016, all devices are connected for free through the community Wi-Fi program. That's in the publication. There's a video. I would look at it. Highline Public Schools, like some others, right away, they're in Ohio, 1,000 hotspots to families. Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind is a statewide school in Utah. They sent out Wi-Fi hotspots, and we're particularly looking at making sure students living on the Navajo Nation reservation had them. It's a big effort, but a lot of districts went and just got the hotspots out there. Richland too, again, they boosted Wi-Fi from the school. They just boosted their own school's Wi-Fi to try to reach the surrounding homes, but at least reach the parking lot so parents or kids who drive can park and upload their work. However, challenges, and really strong challenges, remain even in schools that are well set up with access. And even in the case where internet access is established, there still is a problem when you have multiple people in one home, in one neighborhood, going online. I'm sure we all have had where we drop off. My first question was, is there a phone number I can call into if I drop off of this? And it seems as if even in our best situations, there is always that 1% to 3% of kids who are not reached. And that's something that I think our states, not just our districts, but our states need to work on. One more thing, I'll go very quickly. IT troubleshooting, and this is where I would be raising my hand for help if I were a parent. Rock Hill Public Schools, South Carolina, their IT people donned masks and gloves and met parents at the curbside to help with, to fix their computers. Owsley County Schools, small rural schools in Kentucky, has, among other things, produced a series of how-to videos to help parents and students troubleshoot problems from home. And before we move on to the next question, I want to underscore something I heard Linda Darling-Hammond say yesterday in a webinar. She said having computers and speedy broadband should be, quote unquote, almost a civil right. It's like not having books available a decade or more ago. And we all know here in this webinar, there are still kids without books and supplies, but we still need to move very quickly to end that digital divide and make it be a top priority for reentry plans.
That's great, Barbara. Really appreciate that framing. And you're right. It's really important, like you said, that every family has access to devices and the internet that's necessary for continuing instruction. So thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Lindsay and Melissa quickly to talk about some of the more vulnerable student populations. So as Barbara put really well, all students need access to internet, need devices to continue learning. But we all know, and why we're here, is that there are specific student populations that are even more vulnerable to the shift to online learning and what comes from that. And so maybe we can start with you, Lindsay. Can you share just, from your organization standpoint, what are some of the concerns that you have in serving the populations that you do? And sort of what do you see the district role in supporting those students when it comes to these times?
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for having us and shining a light on this issue, because there are 7 million students with disabilities across the nation, and they're interacting with technology and without technology, like all other students, in different ways. I want to say from the National Center for Learning Disabilities, our biggest and most immediate concern at the beginning of this, you heard Barbara talk about how quickly, and we all lived how quickly this happened. And also, I think you heard from both Allison and Barbara, the intense and incredible variation across our districts of how they're delivering, where they were in the pipeline of being ready, where they are now. For students with disabilities and their families, in many cases, school districts did lean into that hierarchy that you heard Barbara describe, which we agree with. Everyone needs to, obviously there were immediate needs to be served. But unfortunately, our first response from some of our districts was, we don't even know how to deal with kids with disabilities in this. We'll just have to wait a couple weeks, and your IEP, we'll talk to you in 2 to 3 weeks. And so that was, and still is the case in some places. We're seeing great improvements in many, but that was the biggest concern, is that education was stopping completely for groups of students who have rights to education, who already have achievement gaps that are very large, who are across all of the population and in every single school district. And I think it was coming from a place of educators feeling overwhelmed and not knowing what to do. Because as you said, Eric, we didn't have a good playbook for this, and there's a lot of variability and inherent in teaching students with disabilities anyway. I would say we joined with EdTrust, with Digital Promise and others to form a website called educatingalllearners.org, where we wanted to put just actionable tools in the hands of educators right now to get them information about how to work with those students. So some of our concerns, just a few other concerns about actually educating students in the digital environment. We see lots of examples now of terrific services being delivered online and individuals having IEP meetings on the phone, through Zoom, a whole host of different ways that districts are working with families. Some interesting things that are emerging. Classes online for the most of students with disabilities who have learning disabilities, which are issues with reading, writing, math. There is a much heavier content load of reading in what's being offered to students in general now online. There are many, we're getting video, we're getting other things, but schools really need to focus in on how, when students with disabilities are going to be accessing either online or learning packets that might be going home. In some cases, we're seeing districts Xeroxing packets and sending those home. For children with reading disabilities, really we need educators thinking about how they can creatively make those materials accessible. In the digital environment, there are a lot of tools: Zoom Whiteboard, digital stories, Google Mac accessibility features. But in terms of the groups of students that are getting learning packets, we've seen some districts doing things like having students who are advanced readers making recordings of the PDF and sharing those with students who are going to be needing to hear it through audio, access that content through audio. I think the second thing we're seeing is executive functioning. We're all sitting here on Zoom. We spend now way too much time on Zoom, and our computers offer many distractions to us. And so if you think about a child who already has an attention issue or executive functioning, they are going to need some real help. So we're seeing good examples of educators who are helping them use things like alarms on their computer. Other ways that help them stay on task: teachers who are texting students where that's possible, teachers who are really helping with scheduling and who are checking in. Those are things I think that are really helpful and that our educators can do really well. For students with physical disabilities, as a third example, they may have things like an aide in a class that's taking notes for them. That's something that can still happen online. That aide can attend a Zoom class and just as easily continue to provide those types of accommodations. So I actually think, this is a time where we're seeing the real importance of IDEA, and we could really be celebrating the incredible creativity. It's National Teachers Week, and we've been really heartened recently by so many of the examples we've seen of teachers getting into the technology and using it. And so I'd say for advocates, questions that we'd want them to ask to help that, definitely I'd want to ask a school board, how are you getting accessible technology to families? How are you ensuring obviously that's going to come after, do they have technology? Do they have broadband? But not just being sure that you remember there are lots of accessibility tools. How's the district ensuring they're turned on, they're being used, and children know how to work with them? The final thing is, how are you supporting educators? Educators have never been as broadly asked to use these types of tools. They're having to redo their whole lessons. So those are some of the first questions we really hope our advocates are speaking out to their districts and school boards.
Thanks, Lindsay. Great point about the educators too. Extremely important, especially as we highlight them this week. Melissa, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about your organization's perspective on providing supports for English learners and the populations that you serve as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think Allison mentioned that this pandemic has really put in sharper focus inequities that were already well documented, and I think it is important to put that context, forward. That for example, it comes down especially to funding. Title III, which is the program that supports the education of English learners has been flat funded for years up until this past year, and when it saw a small increase. Teachers have long voiced the need for professional development to instruct English learners and not just EL specialists. And even prior to COVID, sorry, I'm getting messages that my internet is unstable, so hopefully you can hear me. Even prior to COVID, the resources, the digital resources available to teachers, many of the ones that they were using weren't well adapted for English learners, and they didn't receive the professional development to use those resources. So I think those are issues that were in place before, and they have just been exacerbated in this time. And of course, in terms of the challenges, I think we know them, have read about them well. Technology sure is definitely, certainly access to devices and connectivity has been a challenge, but even when in the best circumstances, when you have that, having the family support at home to support home learning. Immigrants are disproportionately employed in sectors that are considered essential occupations. So many of them are still working outside the home, which is leaving children and siblings, older siblings, to balance school. And then of course there are the non-technology issues, which are the very basic. These are families that are dealing with economic insecurity and food insecurity, and and I think schools have been that has been front and center, so that's been important. I think in terms of some of the best practices that we've seen, I think we've heard of school districts that when they are providing Chromebooks, that they've already loaded it with software that is in a language that is accessible to them. So I think just thinking about not just providing the devices, but thinking about having the family set it up at home, making it very easy so that they can instantaneously access the content they need. Use of the partnerships that are available in the communities, community-based organizations who are very well, know how to reach immigrant populations, they're trusted by them. I think in the best circumstances, we've seen, for example, Denver Public Schools partnering with groups to deliver school meals, or a lot of these organizations are doing translations, and where some of that is not being addressed well. So I think these partnerships are definitely one of the best practices that we've been seeing.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's really helpful. You brought up something about having sort of clear and understandable communication, or sort of accessible means to communicate with families, given the fact that this is this crisis has been evolving. Conditions change almost daily, hourly. We know how important it is that families are receiving the clear and informative communication that they need to proceed and move forward through this time. Allison, I'd love to hear sort of some of your thoughts about the importance of communication, who and how communicating from districts is sort of who it's been sort of targeted towards, and what's been sort of going on in terms of effective communication, if at all.
Sure. So I was just in a meeting before this webinar with our communications team, who was sharing the findings from a set of surveys that the Education Address did, our West Coast office and our New York office of parents. And it really, the numbers hit home exactly what Melissa and Lindsay were talking about, that families are not experiencing this pandemic equally, and that parents of color and parents from low-income backgrounds, parents of English learners, or parents who themselves are English learners or of English learners, parents of students with disabilities, are much, much more concerned about the impact that this pandemic and school closures is going to have on their students' academic progress. They're much more likely to report that they have financial concerns. And it is really important that schools and districts are maintaining open lines of communication with all families, but particularly our most vulnerable families who are experiencing a lot of understandable stress right now. I would say there's some low-hanging fruit that districts can do, and we have some good examples. So a central website or hub where the district updates daily, general pieces of information about IT support, where families can get meals, the current date that the government has said that the schools will be closed through. So Miami-Dade County Schools, their website is, I think, pretty good. It's very mobile friendly. It's available in multiple languages. It's updated regularly. But a website isn't true communication. And so I would say that really what we want to be doing as advocates is pushing for two-way communication. And that requires reaching out to families. So Schoolhouse Connection has suggested, for example, that districts encourage teachers to get a Skype or Google Voice number so that they can easily communicate with families without having to put a burden on their, mobile plan. And then probably the best example, which we'll talk about more when we talk about supporting students' social and emotional well-being, is Phoenix Union, which implemented their Every Student, Every Day initiative. And it's exactly what it sounds like. They mobilize pretty much every adult in the district, not just teachers, paraprofessionals, and people who work in the cafeteria who are matched with students. And they reach out to those students every single day and provide obviously communication from the schools and districts, but are also able then to receive information about the needs that those students and those families have. And then there's a centralized way for them to communicate that back to the district so the district can meet those kids' needs.
Thanks, Allison. Any other thoughts from our panelists about, communication to families, challenges you may have seen, or things that you've seen that have been going well? Barbara, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. What I just want to add to something Allison said. Some of the folks I talked to said when the bus drivers, because initially this is all that was going on, was bus drivers delivering food and maybe some packets, but the interaction of bus drivers and kids, the kids were so excited to see them. They were making signs, and the bus drivers likewise. So it's not just teachers and parents. It's that whole school community feeling. So we're all in this together. Sorry, it's a little trite now, but it's true. I really appreciated what you said there.
I would just say for students with disabilities as well, I think people, if you know the law, IDEA, parents work with those children through individualized education plans, IEPs. And we've got there are some great examples out there for teachers about how to speak about that virtually with a parent, because they can be lengthy, they can be very hard to access. And we've seen some really great examples of districts coming up with really useful and good discussions so parents can understand what's going on and get good communication through that.
Thank you. So shifting a little bit towards instruction. So Barbara, you mentioned this a little earlier, some of the different ways that instruction's been happening through these times. Can you elaborate on the many ways that schools and districts have provided instruction, what you've seen, and how districts should start to consider decisions about instruction?
Mm-hmm. This will piggyback a little bit on what Melissa said too. So, really what you're looking at now are synchronous and asynchronous types of instruction. In the document, there is a handout on the full definition from the Digital Promise used for another project. So I won't go into all those details, but I can tell you that talking to superintendents, teachers, and listening to some students on a League of Innovative Schools webinar this week, it's clear that adults and students, they need both. And here's why they need both. The word of the day, one of the words of the day is flexibility. And how can we be flexible in providing education services to all students and their families and caregivers? And the other key phrase of the day is staying connected. So starting with staying connected, that's synchronous. That's Zoom, Google meetings, which help build and nurture relationships and connections, which we need even before COVID-19 hit. We need those relationships to help each learner have a sense of belonging. And the research says that creating that sense of belonging, creating those relationships is a real first step for learning to occur. One of our partners, and I might put this in the chat, at the Learner Variability Project is Dr. Pamela Cantor. I don't know, most of you may know, she founded a group called Turnaround for Children. She just did a podcast on why it's important for educators to focus on relationship building and students' emotional well-being during the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, she and we do, and I'm sure all of you do as well. These things are important anyway. We just need to focus on them even more now that kids are not in school. In terms of asynchronous, now here's where flexibility is key. You have teachers who have their own children at home, right? You have parents who are working but need to facilitate their children's schoolwork. It could be a student with a disability where they need help and attention while they're doing their work, and there are students who may need to care for siblings because their parents are essential workers or financially they need to work and their job is open. They all need teaching and learning to fit into their schedules. And so again, districts who already were engaged in this type of distance learning had an easier transition. Owsley, this is again in Kentucky, they moved to non-traditional instruction, they call it, prior to COVID-19, where they combine online and in-school learning. Initially, it was to help out with the snow days, but they've resurrected that, and I think they use that during the year. So they're always in and out of school, and that made this transition a lot easier. The students were more comfortable with it. The parents understood, and there was a lot of interaction prior. Once again, too, Utah Schools for the Blind and the Deaf also had, prior to COVID-19, a statewide network of virtual classroom experiences for their students. And they felt that that really helped, also with student agency, because you're working with these kids to, to develop this ability to use the technology to learn, on their own. Those are just some examples.
No, that's great. Thanks, Barbara. And other panelists would love to hear your perspective about how these different instructional techniques either impact or how should districts be thinking about targeting those specific populations. And then any other thoughts about, Barbara, as you brought up sort of the social emotional learning needs and how important that is. Any other thoughts about that as well?
If no one else is going to talk, I can mention SEL, but Lindsay, are you going?
I was just looking at Melissa. I think Melissa has something to say.
Oh, Melissa. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I would just add on the instruction and emphasize, the importance of thinking about low-tech options, and just that's the reality that we have to think about. And for English learners, of course, these students are most at risk of falling behind academically, but also in terms of their English language development. And so just want to reemphasize the point, the importance of having opportunities both with teachers, but also peers who provide an opportunity to practice English, and even in a casual environment. I think those are important because that might not be available at home. And I think, speaking as a parent of a young child, I think I'm making use of the rich, we can debate the quality of resources that are out there for families that homeschool their children normally, but that is just not available in other languages. And so even if parents want to take that initiative, it's very difficult to do that from home and play a bigger role in doing that. And I think affluent families are going to be providing those supplemental opportunities one way or another. And I think we have to think these families are very much depending on whatever the school offers. That's what they're using.
That's great. Lindsay, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to add one thing, which is for children with disabilities, many of them receive one-to-one instruction in certain environments. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of that, because that was one of the biggest mental blocks I think many people had originally was, but I'd provide instruction. I'm a physical therapist. I'm an occupational therapist. or in providing a real individualized instruction experience. And I will just say, we have seen some incredible stories from occupational therapists and physical therapists and others about things they're learning and doing over Zoom, where those are professions where we've always had some issues with shortages of professionals, rural areas not being able to access the same level of people who are trained in those types of specialties. And we're seeing some great things here that they're able to do. We're also, there's some wonderful stories from school psychologists all over the nation who have been working on with children with autism or other social pragmatic language kind of issues, where they're finding some of those kids really respond to tech, which was something we would not normally say, but they are providing it in an environment where it's bringing out a new side. So it's leading to some innovation in those areas as well. I would just say that those one-to-one services really can be provided from a distance in some cases. And when they can't be, we do have parent coaching models. But as Melissa was mentioning, I mean, this really relies on an affluent parent who has time and resources and can be doing something that intensive with their student. So it's a challenge.
That's great. Thank you. I like the optimistic tone about just the place or the opportunity for innovation. I think that's a really good framing. I want to leave some time for our Q&A from our audience and some of the questions that were asked before the webinar and even in our group chat. But wanted to quickly, I think we've all sort of talked a little bit about sort of the social emotional well-being of students during this time. We know they're going through a lot, and school has often provided a lot of that support. Would love to hear sort of from anyone, what are some of the ways that, the social emotional learning and sort of well-being of students has been affected through these school closures, and what have you seen, if anything, that points to promising practices to address those? Allison, you want to start, or Barbara, or whoever?
Allison, do you want to go?
I do have some thoughts, but I really want Barbara to talk about the ruler program in El Segundo first, and then I'll jump in with some extra things.
That's what I was
It's such a great example, and I know you're the best one to talk about it.
Yeah, El Segundo, it's another Digital Promise League of Innovative Schools district, and they're just a little south of Los Angeles. And they did I just did a webinar with them and Mark Brackett at Yale. So they built, first of all, what has really helped, and this isn't everywhere, but this is what, if you were going to go forward with a promising practice, this is a nice way to look. They build into their mission a portrait of a graduate. And one of their pillars is to help children, to nurture them to be responsible, resilient, and self-directed. And what they took that then and did a district-wide approach to weaving social and emotional learning into academics. They used Yale's Ruler program. And the interesting thing, and there's a lot of programs out there, the interesting thing with Ruler is that it actually starts with the adults. So the teachers, and you could do this with parents as well. The teachers learn to understand and regulate their own emotion, and their permission to feel, as the author Mark Brackett wrote his book on that. But only then do they go and help students. And what a principal, Alice Lee, said in El Segundo is that her students have now taken that language home. And so when the anxiety rises and, when the fear comes out or whatnot, they have a vocabulary that they can use, that they're teaching their parents. And they've also created these family charters, which is what they do in the classroom. So it doesn't necessarily need to be this particular program, but those concepts are great. And because they had this before COVID-19, they felt that their kids, their students, their families, their caregivers they have a language and an understanding of the importance of also developing these skills.
Thanks, Barbara. Anyone else have anything to add, Allison?
I just want to use this as an opportunity to talk for a second about the importance of supporting homeless students and students in temporary housing and students in foster care. So districts can and should still be using their McKinney-Vento homeless liaisons and foster care liaisons to continue to identify and support those student groups. And we have some really great examples in the guide of states and districts that have been pretty innovative in figuring out how to continue to identify and serve those students through social distancing precautions. So for example, Kern County schools in California, they have an online referral form that allows community partners who become aware of students who are homeless or in transitional housing. They can use this online form to easily communicate with the school district and make sure that those students are getting the supports and services they need. And Schoolhouse Connection also recommends using social media as a way to communicate with homeless students. And I just feel like I am particularly concerned about those students and wanted to use this as an opportunity to highlight that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Allison. All right, we have about 12 minutes. We have a lot of really good questions, both from our chat and from some questions that were asked before the webinar. So I want to get to them. There's a lot of really good questions about English learners. Wanted to, Melissa, give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the translation tools. One person asked about what are some of the tools to transmit and translate messages in multiple languages, resources in multiple languages to sort of help with teach parents how to use laptops and access learning resources. What are some of the, I guess, promising practices or districts that have sort of led in this space and have some good resources or organizations that you can point to for our audience?
Yeah, there are a lot of good things. I think in the first few weeks, I think everybody was swamped with a bunch of resources, and so I think not all of it is coming from districts, but for example, in California, Californians Together is holding weekly webinars and communities of practice for teachers of English learners. So when we talked about teachers just not having the PD opportunities, and especially related to distance learning. So we are finding that a number of organizations are certainly able to fill some of those gaps. And I think some states are culling their resources right now and putting together, for example, in New York, a website, for teachers of English learners and their resources. So I think we are seeing some things. Colorín Colorado is a website that many teachers probably know of already, but if you don't, I would definitely point you to that as a starting place, and they've pulled together a lot of great resources.
That's great. Thank you for that. Questions about teachers and sort of the support that educators need during this time. Sorry. Can you all hear me? What are some of the things that you've seen, Allison, or anyone from a sort of supporting teachers perspective that are useful? And Barbara, I know you all have led sort of some of the coaching aspects of this as well. So we'd love to hear from any of you about what has been done to support teachers during this transition time.
You want to go ahead, Allison, or?
So we've touched on this a little bit, but I think it is important to acknowledge that even the very best teachers have never taught under these circumstances. I'm a former classroom teacher myself, and I think every day about what I would be doing to meet the needs of my 5th and 6th grade students, almost all of whom are English learners during this time. And so districts have a really important role to play in supporting teachers. I'm hoping Barbara will talk a little bit about coaching models that can be leveraged. And I think that districts really need to focus particularly on the schools, the highest need schools, which tend to have less effective, less experienced staff, less capacity, and overall and are probably struggling with this transition, or definitely struggling with this transition more so than others, and that whatever support the district can provide to those school leaders and to those teachers to help navigate this transition is really, really essential.
Well, we've done a study on coaching, and I mean, keep it short here. I mean, the impact of coaching on teachers, it's like tailoring instruction for students. It's tailoring instruction for teachers, and the end result of the study was that it is very impactful. And how do you do that online? I mean, you do have to convert it from going into the classroom to do your traditional professional learning. However, a lot of districts have provided teachers with videos. I can't remember exactly who it was, but they've teamed up like their school psychologists, their reading specialist, etc., to give impromptu professional development to not only the special education teachers, but general education teachers who have special education kids in their class, to help them better understand their kids and know what is appropriate to do and how you can help these kids, all kids, meet their potential. So I think that you can convert all of that into an online professional development type seminars, which some of these schools are doing already. It's interesting though, because one of the silver linings I was talking to some of you guys about earlier, and one of them, a teacher said, is, man, it's really giving us ownership of the technology. And how do you really use it to be effective? How do you use technology to be collaborative? I think Hilda mentioned something, your kids are tired of screen time. And some of that is because, Hilda, it depends on how you're using it. And we don't really have time to get into all of that here, but there is a way to use technology. We have a 360 program where kids in different parts of the world put together their 360 view of the world. It's very culturally responsive. It gets kids up front in the driver's seat. They're the directors, they're the actors. They tell their stories on 360 video, and then they connect with people in different communities across the world. There's some wonderful stuff that can come out of technology where you're not just, like I said, sitting in an echo chamber with too much screen time.
Yeah, that's great, Barbara.
Just one more thought, Eric.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Before you move on. I think Barbara mentioned, knowing where your teachers need support. And I just want to flag that there's a link in the guide to this really great readiness quiz that came out of the Center for Teaching Innovation at Cornell. It's intended for university staff, but it's really good examples of the kind of questions that we should be pushing our districts to ask their teachers about their own readiness to use technology, to connect with, to teach, to assess students. And I just wanted to flag that because I think it's such a good example.
Thanks, Allison. That's great. We have 5 more minutes. I want to quickly, there are a couple of folks who have asked about IDEA and sort of the future implications moving forward with that, and what the Department of Ed or any folks who may be doing to change anything in any way. So would like Lindsay to sort of talk about that and any implications that you see moving forward.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks to those who asked this question. So we're really concerned about IDEA. And the reason is because in the CARES Act, which passed in early March, or in middle of March, feels like, 40 years ago now, but in the CARES Act, Congress said to the Secretary of Education, come back and report to us what provisions of IDEA we might need to waive, we might need to not enforce. What civil rights of children should we take away during this time because they're too hard to enforce? She delivered her report at the beginning of last week, and we were very pleased with what that report said. It basically said there are 2 timelines that are in the statute that are specific. They're 45 days, and they're involving eligibility determinations, which really do need to be made in person as we deliver those types of tests to determine if a student has a disability and is eligible. We deliver those in person, and there's a whole observation that has to happen. Those very, very narrow things are going to be hard to enforce right now, and so we don't need to do them. But the second school resumes and it becomes possible to perform those evaluations, we need to do them. And if a student is going from one section of the law to the other where they've been eligible and we're just seeing if they're going to be eligible again, provide them the services, assume they need them, and then if they don't, we'll find out later, it'll be okay. We're very concerned about this because we're seeing many advocacy groups push to delay implementation, to basically take away rights from children for as long as 8 weeks after the resumption of normal school year. I think all of us are spending a lot of time wondering, when will there be a normal resumption to the school year? We're thinking there's going to be social distancing. Kids may go on different days. So if you have to wait another 8 weeks until we have a vaccine for the pandemic, we're going to lose a generation of students who have disabilities who will not have access to any education. I feel like we've found so many incredible examples of individuals who are doing great things for kids. I would just say, if you want to advocate for kids during this time to Congress, we at NCLD are promoting a campaign along with the disability community, and it's hashtag #MyIDEA_matters. You can find a lot of information about it if it's something you want to speak up about. Thank you.
That's great. And it's a good segue to, we have a couple more minutes. Just want to end with some things that advocates can do moving forward, what they should be tracking in addition to what's happening with IDEA. But would love to hear just, last final words of encouragement for advocates and what they should be thinking about. So Allison, do you want to start?
Sure. So I want to start by flagging that districts are most likely in many states going to be applying for the stimulus funds that their state gets. And how that happens is going to vary a lot state by state, but that advocates can really be pushing for their districts to be answering the questions that we talked about here and the questions that are in our guide, to be in those plans and to be pushing for those plans for instructional continuity to be public. It should not be a secret what your district's plan is for continuing to teach all students while schools are closed, and particularly if they're receiving money to do so. And also I'll just say, the guide that this really amazing group of people who I got to partner with created is designed for you all to be able to easily use. Write an email to your district leaders and say, I'd like to have a Zoom meeting, and to share with your membership, to talk about what issues are highest priority to you and your constituency, and to ask these questions to your district leaders, and also share promising practices when the answer isn't exactly what you want to hear. I think, as my colleagues have said, although it's an incredibly difficult time that we're in, there's some really innovative and exciting things happening that we should be sharing.
That's great. All right. Thank you all. You guys were amazing. This was a really enjoyable conversation. Sergio, do you want to close us out?
We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I just want to thank the panelists and everyone for joining the webinar today. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a copy of the recording along with a copy to our district advisory guide and other resources in a follow-up email early next week. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.